So, Professor Cammett, to what extent do you think that social policy has alleviated social problems in the Arab states since around 2000?
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, we'd have to take this on a country by country basis, but in general terms, public investment in social sectors and public investment in general, public spending as a percentage of GDP has been declining over time, particularly since the 1980s, and this has direct implications for social policy and particularly for social service provision. So on the one hand, I think there is a downward trend in the sense that people have historically been reliant on the public sector for education, for health, and these kinds of core basic services, and yet the public sector is finding it increasingly difficult to supply the services, or at least to supply high quality services. So as we've seen in other parts of the world, in other developing regions, there has been increasing emphasis on targeted social policies, such as cash transfer programs, and there are programs in the Arab world that are certainly being deployed here to try to target some of the poorest of the poor. And these are very helpful, but they're not going to solve the underlying problems, which are that infrastructure is declining and that public services have been declining. And these, of course, are the services that low-income people rely on more than people of middle class and upper class. So really what needs to happen is a more sustained investment in public services, if possible by states, because states have the largest reach across their national territories, but if not, then in partnership with non-state providers, on the condition that the public sector is heavily involved in regulating the quality of these services and access to these services so that there's equitable access to services. But of course, there is a critical and important role for governments in social policy. It's just that with the declining fiscal capacity of states across the Arab world, states have been less and less able to supply services in a way that they used to. And the last point I'll make here is that in the earlier decades after independence, so well before the 2000s, the question was making improvements in basic social indicators, reducing infant mortality, increasing literacy, and so forth. And those kinds of interventions are easier to achieve than sort of second-order interventions that involve addressing more complex public health challenges or more advanced educational needs. And so that has been a challenge, not just in the Arab world, but in other regions that requires, particular kinds of investments and particular kinds of engagement on the part of the state.
Okay. And you talked about cash transfers.
Yeah.
And you said that on the one hand, they were helpful. Can you just expand on that? What do you mean helpful? Because they're targeted, aren't they?
Yes.
Particular individuals.
Yeah, so cash transfers are, targeted at low income and vulnerable individuals. So to the extent that states have the informational capacity to find out where these individuals are, to locate them and to provide resources to them, they can certainly alleviate poverty and sometimes improve basic social indicators depending on how they're structured. They're obviously not going to solve all problems. And one of the particular challenges in the Arab world is that these countries across the board have very high subsidies for things like fuel and basic foodstuffs. And populations have become very reliant on subsidies, and yet these subsidies constitute an important portion of the budget. And international financial institutions are always telling governments in the region, you need to cut subsidies. But of course, the poor in particular are reliant on them, even if they are spread across all segments. They're not targeted generally. And so cash transfers come in because if you're going to reduce subsidies, you need to replace them with something else because people can't be left on their own with nothing to support themselves. So they do play an important role. They're just not going to solve all the problems here. And they also require a certain level of informational capacity on the part of the state to be able to identify and target cash transfers.
Okay, and there's a particular philosophy and an ideology that goes around targeting.
Yes.
What might be an alternative ideology or philosophy?
Yes.
Or model?
Right. So targeting is often associated with sort of what we call neoliberal reforms, although this term is such a vague term and has been bandied about quite a bit. But certainly associated with kind of market-driven visions of reforming the economy. So with the creation of markets and investment in the private sector as the engine of growth, not everybody's going to win. In fact, a lot of people are not going to win. So cash transfer programs and these kinds of targeted programs are often associated with market-driven models of development. Although we've seen quite an extensive rollout of them in Latin America, and they seem to have had an important effect. And scholars who are not big proponents of marketization have actually demonstrated that cash transfer programs, if rolled out in a comprehensive way, can play an important role in alleviating poverty, and also if they're conditional on sort of access to, participation in health programs or education, they might have second order effects on social development as well.
There are debates about conditionality
Yes.
as a philosophy as well. And I was just wondering about, in terms of the actual people getting cash in their hands, do you think that apart from being able to buy things that people need, that it actually offers people choice, some empowerment? Do you see that as part and parcel of the whole range across improving quality of life, not just around direct poverty?
So, cash is no substitute for having, leading a healthy life, being well educated, having opportunities. So these, in my view, are sort of Band-Aid solutions. They're not fundamental reforms, which require something much deeper, which require a fundamental transformation of power and state-society relations, and sort of the construction of more inclusive political economies. But there has been a shift, as you well know, towards cash transfer programs rather than conditional cash transfer programs, as being potentially more effective and also more empowering, in that they give people, or are designed supposedly to give people choice. And I know increasingly in humanitarian contexts, cash transfer programs are becoming a major policy instrument because it's the sort of fastest way to roll out resources to extremely vulnerable refugee populations that may not have access to labor markets in the host countries where they're based, and don't have access to adequate services and so forth, the way citizens may have in those countries.
So we're going to move slightly different topic, really. Do you see social policy as having a role in social conflict?
Yeah, so I think there is a really interesting connection between social policy and conflict, particularly in the potential for social policy to create investment in a national political community. So there's an enormous literature in the social sciences on diversity and public goods provision, diversity and social spending, the upshot of which is that more diverse places along ethnic, religious, racial lines tend to have lower investment in social sectors and social spending, and less developed welfare regimes, less investment in public goods provision. But we can sort of reverse the causal arrow there and look at the effects of investment in social sectors, particularly in inclusive social policy, in creating commitment to a national political identity. And I think there's been some research that shows that if you invest inclusively, you're more likely to build greater commitment to the national political community, and greater commitment, a greater sense of social solidarity, and a shared stake in a shared polity. The problem is, of course, how do you reverse that causal arrow? There's some interconnection between the two, and you're more likely to get inclusive social policy where you have people feeling committed to a national political community. But there is some research, particularly on the case of Tanzania, for example, that showed that investment in a shared national political identity, which albeit came at something of a cost, did lead to increased social spending and public goods.
In relation to social contract.
Yes.
And also psychological contracts,
Yes.
of trust and availability. You've been doing research in this area for a long, long time. Where do you see the main research area going in the future? What direction do you think research should take, given the incredible changes that are going on as we speak in the MENA region?
Yeah. I mean, I think research comes at different levels. On the one hand, there's research that's more immediately policy relevant, sort of almost impact evaluation. So if we deploy this cash transfer program or this entrepreneurship program, wherever it might be, what are the effects? And there's been excellent work analyzing different programs, showing which ones are more effective. So that's sort of one level of research that has direct policy implications. But I think a lot of social scientists are engaged in deeper levels of research that is less immediately apparent, less immediately connected to social policy reforms or recommendations. And that is sort of, why is it that some places are more likely to invest more in social sectors and social spending? And for me, this is a very interesting area of research, and it's sort of one direction I'd like to go, which is explaining variation in levels of social investment within the Middle East and North Africa, for example. Are there long-term historical legacies that affect these factors, these outcomes, or and why does that matter? I think that too, on some level, is policy relevant, because we can't ignore the larger underlying political and social context when we roll out policy reforms, because the same policy reform is not going to work the same way in different political contexts. So we can't ignore the larger political contexts that give rise to different social policies.
And do you see more of a role in qualitative research at a grassroots level, finding out about the experiences of individuals in the field as they are happening to them?
Yes. So I'm a long-term proponent of mixed methods research, and also of the value of very different kinds of research. So I think that research that's quantitative and looks at large N samples, whether at the subnational level or at the cross-national level, although often cross-national research is trickier to pull off, I think that has an important role, because we can see the generalizability of findings and look at trends and patterns that apply broadly. But I also think that qualitative research is indispensable, for one thing, to look at how people experience social programs on the ground, or navigate their different paths of gaining access to social welfare. And this is work that I've done in Lebanon, for example, that combines both methods. I also think that you can't do good quantitative research without qualitative research, in terms of interpreting the findings or even designing questionnaires or methods of data collection.
All right, Professor, thank you very much.